Buenas tardes, sean bienvenidos a este Extension Talk titulado Manejo de riego, no me preguntes a mí, pregúntale al árbol, organizada por UC Chile, centro que representa a la Universidad de California Davis en el país y que busca ser un puente para extender el conocimiento y experiencia de California. Esta Extension Talk forma parte del programa de extensión e innovación en ciruelo europeo que desarrolla UC Davis Chile en conjunto con Prune. La presentación estará a cargo del Dr. Kenneth Shackel, reconocido profesor e investigador de UC Davis. Ken, Dr. Agua Shackel, obtuvo su doctorado en Plant Science en UC Riverside, trabajando en fisiología de las plantas, y se especializó en el manejo del riego y la respuesta fisiológica de las plantas al estrés hídrico. La mayoría de los proyectos de investigación que ha realizado el laboratorio de Ken han sido financiados por los llamados grupos de productos commodities de California. Todos los proyectos incluyen la cooperación de especialistas en extensión y asesores agrícolas. Uno de los principales objetivos de la investigación es utilizar la cámara utilizar la cámara de presión, también conocida como bomba de presión o Cholander, para medir el estrés y gestionar el riego en función del nivel de estrés experimentado por la planta. Cuando se trata de riego, el lema de Ken es: no me preguntes a mí, pregúntale al árbol. La presentación se realizará con traducción simultánea y los que tienen, bueno, en suma abajo hay aparece una opción que dice interpretación o interpretation o traducción, que pueden cambiar para escucharlo en inglés o en español. Y también abajo hay una sección que se llama Q&A o pregunta y respuesta, dependiendo si ustedes tienen el Zoom en español o en inglés, donde pueden ir mandando sus preguntas, las cuales serán contestadas al final de la charla. Ken, if you can turn on your mic now and share your presentation, please.
Okay. Okay, is that okay?
Yes.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me for this talk. I'm going to be talking about irrigation management, and we'll have some examples in prunes, but I think this also applies to other fruit trees. And as my introducer already said, that my, okay, I'm having, wait a minute. Okay, that my motto is don't ask me, ask the tree. And in a more scientific way, I can say plant-based irrigation management. So I'm going to go over some introductory material very quickly. I'm pretty sure everyone in this audience knows that plants use a lot of water. I assume you can see my pointer, is that correct? Anybody? Okay, well, so how do we know this? We measure how much water the plants use, and we measure this by building a very large container, a pot, fill it with soil, and put it on a truck scale. And if you plant a tree in this pot, like this tree here, it becomes a weighing lysimeter. And you can measure the weight of the tree and the soil and all the water in the soil very accurately. And what you see is, this is a graph of a few days in August in 2016 when the tree was about 2 years old. And when we irrigate the tree, the weight goes up. And here you see that we've added about 400 kilograms of water to this tree. And then when we stop irrigating, in this case, we stopped irrigating at night. And the weight doesn't change very much at night because the trees don't use much water during the night. But during the day, they use a lot of water, and you can see the weight drop. And this happens every day. And over these 3 days, the average water use was 125 kilograms a day. And the reason why we say this is a lot of water is because 125 kilograms of water is more than this tree weighs. So a tree can use more than its entire weight in 1 day. Now, most of this water is being lost by transpiration. That is, that the leaves, in order to fix carbon, the leaves must allow water to be lost. And this is, and photosynthesis must occur inside the leaves. I'll talk a little bit about, more about that, but the reason why photosynthesis is important is because this is the way the plant makes sugars and allows the plant to grow fruits and everything that it needs to live. But the water can evaporate from the leaves, or it can evaporate from the soil. So we have a common term that we call ET, or evapotranspiration, that includes all the water that is lost from the orchard. Now, the standard approach to irrigation scheduling is to use this idea of ET and the idea of a soil as a reservoir to schedule irrigations. So what that means is that the tree and the orchard uses water in ET, and it uses up whatever water is stored in the soil. Then every day you add up how many millimeters or inches of water are lost until it gets to a value that you think is allowable for that tree to deplete water. And then you irrigate. But there are other ways to measure how much water the tree is using. For instance, you can monitor it using soil methods, like a shovel or a tensiometer, or you can monitor how much the weather is causing water to evaporate. And this is the most common method, and again, it's a standard method, and I'm sure this is also used in Chile, that we have a reference ET, which sometimes might be a pan for some people, but in other cases might be a weather system, a weather station data. And the assumption is that if the reference is not using any water, then an orchard will not use any water. But if the reference does use some water, then it's very simple that you multiply that amount of water that the reference uses by some number to get how much water the crop is using, and this number is called the crop coefficient. So if the crop coefficient is 1, then the crop is using the same water as the reference. If the crop coefficient is 1.5, then the crop is using 50% more water than the reference. And then you just need to find out from the weather station what the reference ET is for that day, and you add that up. Now, and there are many crop coefficient values for many orchards, including prune trees, and you probably have access to that. But I would say that we must ask the question, why are we irrigating? What is the goal of irrigation management? One goal that many textbooks say is that you need to supply the evapotranspiration, the ET, need of the plant. That's one possible goal. Another textbook may say no, that you're trying to keep the soil at an optimal water content. Or another textbook may say, no, you're trying to keep the soil at an optimal water tension, such as might be measured by a tensiometer. But I'm Dr. Shackel, and I say no, none of these is the goal. The goal is to try to get the plant to do what you want it to do, okay? That may be different for different orchards, but it's just a more simple question about water. If, for instance, I say, do the trees need water? If I put this much water now, will the trees give me a beneficial response in yield or quality or tree growth now or later? So it's based on the plant and what the plant will do and what you want the plant to do. So there's a movie called Forrest Gump. Maybe people have seen this, but my use of that movie is to say, stress is as stress does in trees. That means if you want to know if a tree is under water stress, then you can irrigate it. If it gives a beneficial response, then you can say, yes, it was under stress. If it doesn't give a beneficial response, then either it wasn't under stress, or maybe there was some stress, but there wasn't anything you could do about it by irrigating. Okay, So I'm going to show just one quick example of 1-year-old almond trees here in near Davis. And these are the trees at the end of 1 year of growth. And if you know about how almond trees grow, these trees look pretty good for a 1-year-old tree. You can see that they have a lot of vegetative growth and so on. Now, these trees were given 50% of the calculated value for ET. And I should emphasize that the calculated value for ET for a young tree is not a very big value. It's not near what a full orchard would use. But they were given 50% of that, and yet they still grew pretty well. So the Forrest Gump principle is, well, were they stressed? Well, if you want to know if they were stressed, you water them more. So these trees were given 100% of the ET, and you can see that the trees grew very big. So yes, these trees were under some stress. Even though they looked okay, they were under some stress according to their growth. But again, you can ask, well, is 100% of ET good enough? Were these trees under some stress? So we actually irrigated trees to 300% of ET. And I should mention right away that I am not recommending 300% of ET, because a lot of that will depend on the soil. But my purpose in showing this is that the question is, did these trees respond? And the answer is yes, they responded already even to more water. So that this means that even these trees, which grew very well, were under some water stress. They were limited by water availability. So this is the reason why we have to think about the plant and try to measure the plant to find out if the trees are under stress. So for young orchards, filling the space quickly, getting a lot of tree growth may be very important. I should also mention that when the trees got this big, which was very unusual for 1-year-old almond trees, many of the farmers told me that when the wind would blow, all these trees would fall over, but they did not fall over. And the reason why was because they had very large tops on the trees, but also very large and strong root systems. But this may depend on the soil. In any case, for a young orchard, you may want the tree to grow as quickly as possible to give you early economic returns. But if it's a mature orchard, you may not want a lot of excessive vegetative growth. So it will depend on the orchard and probably depend on the soil, but it depends on the orchard as to what you want the tree to do. So now we need to understand a little bit how trees respond to water stress. We need to think of a leaf as a factory, and that factory has a door that the factory, many leaves on the plant are just a lot of factories, and the plants use a lot of water, and the reason why is because it has openings on the leaf called stomata. They are the openings that allow carbon dioxide to come in for photosynthesis, but they are also openings that allow water to leave. So just like the door to the factory needs to be open if you want the factory to continue to work, the stomata have to be open if you want the factory to fix carbon dioxide. So that's why plants use a lot of water when they are very active and growing. But the second rule then is, since it's so much water, the water has to be replaced by water uptake from the soil. And what this means is that the roots must take water from the soil. And the water in the soil does not go to the roots because the water likes to be in the root. The only reason why the water goes from the soil to the root is because the root is pulling on the water, because the air is pulling on the water in the leaf. So this means that the tree itself is in the middle of a tug of war for water. I don't know if they have this name in Chile or in Spanish, but when people are trying to pull on opposite ends of a rope, we call this a tug of war. So the atmosphere has great power to evaporate water, but if the stomata are closed, very little water, like at night, as you saw in the lysimeter experiment, very little water will evaporate when the doors to the factory are closed. But when they open, then that atmosphere will evaporate water from the leaves. And in order to replace that water, the leaves have to pull water from the stem. And then the stem has to pull water from the branches and from the trunk and from the roots. And then the roots have to pull water from the soil. So all of this pulling is a suction. Everything, all the water in the tree is under suction, especially during the day. And when the soil dries, then the soil starts pulling back and holding the water more strongly. So even when the soil is wet, there is some resistance to water movement through the soil to the root. But when the soil gets dry, that resistance increases. So the suction in the tree, what the tree feels of a suction, it goes up as the soil dries, and also goes up every day and down at night when the tree's not using water. Now, this suction can be strong enough to pull water out of the cells of the leaf and cause the leaf to wilt. Okay, so this is because the cells are inflated with a sort of a water pressure, and when the suction becomes high enough and they lose that pressure, then they deflate like a balloon deflates. So measuring the suction in the plant is the key to understanding how the plant feels and how it will be behaving, and whether the doors to the factory are open or whether they're closed or partially closed, or whether it's growing or not growing. This suction is called water potential, and the water potential is what is measured by the pressure chamber. But there are many ways to measure what people would call plant water stress. And so you can see these ways on the internet, and some of these ways measure plant water stress with water potential. Other ways measure it by measuring something in the plant that might be correlated with water potential. I am going to talk about the pressure chamber, which many of you probably already know about. It's like measuring blood pressure in people. I always wanted to be a doctor, so that's why I kind of like using it. Because instead of the pressure in your blood, this measures the tension, the suction on the water in the plant. And remember that that tension is felt throughout the plant, in the roots, in the stems, in the leaves, and in the cells that are in your factory in the leaves. Okay, so the way we sample a leaf to measure stem water potential is we put a bag on a leaf in the shade, and then we allow that bag to wait for about 10 minutes. Usually we put the bag on and then go to another tree and put the bag there, and then by the time we're finished with all the trees that we want to measure, we come back to the first tree and we can measure it. And we call this stem water potential because this leaf is not transpiring, and the tension on its leaf is the same as the tension where the stem that the leaf is attached. Okay, so you can take that leaf off. You can put that into a pressure chamber. This is a pump-up pressure chamber. But the reason I like this pump-up chamber is because you can see very well the petiole of the leaf. And what you are waiting for is for water to come out of the veins, of the xylem veins of the petiole, where the water is moving to go from the roots to the leaves. And it's fairly easy to see this. So you keep pumping until you see this, and then you record the pressure that was necessary to cause this water to come out. Now, if you do this all day, if you begin in the morning, you will see that there's very low pressure in the pressure chamber. That means there's very low tension in the tree. That means it's because the tree is not transpiring and not pulling very much because it's dark, and the stomata the doors to the factory are closed, and there's not much water demand. But over the course of the day, then the tension, the number that you get in the pressure chamber, gets higher and higher, more and more bars of pressure. And that's because during the day, the evaporation is strong and the tension is strong. And then at night, it goes back to being not so strong anymore. So what we have found for prunes, and as well as almonds and a lot of other trees, is that there's a certain range of values that are typical for different kinds of days. So if it's a cool, humid day, then the value in the middle part of the day might only be 6 bars. If it's a dry, hot day, it might be almost 10 bars, but there's a fairly narrow range of water potential that will correspond to a tree that's under fully irrigated conditions, where the soil is so wet that it's not limiting to the uptake of water in the tree. So this is what we call a baseline. And if the fully irrigated value says that it's 9 bars on that day, but you measure 15 bars, sorry, this is in megapascals. Sometimes we use bars, sometimes we use megapascals, but it's an easy conversion, just move the decimal. If the baseline fully irrigated value is 9 and the tree measures 15, then you know that the tree is under some stress. Now, maybe this is a good stress or maybe it's a bad stress. That's a different question. But at least physiologically, we know that it's not at the fully irrigated value. And that's because that at that point, the soil is starting to dry and starting to hold water back from the tree. Now we have tables. I'm sure these will also be available to you for, these are the tables for prune trees. And because it depends on how hot and dry the air is, it depends on the air temperature and also the humidity. So if the humidity is 40% and the temperature is 26.7 degrees C, then you would expect a value of about 6.5. So you can see that under cool, humid conditions, the value might be almost 5, and under hot, dry conditions, it may be as much as 12.5. But this is, again, is the range. So now that we understand that, now we can ask the question, well, what happens if you give them less water than fully irrigation? So we started many years ago to do experiments. In fact, prune trees were the first trees that we did experiments in using the pressure chamber. And the experiment that we did for 3 years in, I think it was 1990, around 1992 or so, was that we had many different treatments. One treatment was full irrigation, which at that time was 100% ET. And then we withheld water. We stopped watering either at the early stage of fruit growth, or the first half of the growth stage 2, or the second half, or both first and second halves, or after harvest, or late in the growth stage of the fruit. So we had many different treatments, and you can see that the 100% ET used the most water, and the D2, that is withholding water for the entire period of the lag phase in fruit growth, used the least amount of water. And it saved a lot of water based on ET. But the question was what these trees did. Now, these were 7-year-old commercial French prunes. Okay, so from 1989 to 1991, 3 years. It had drip irrigation, but there was a big difference in the blocks of the orchard. One of the sides, the north side, had a relatively shallow depth of soil, and the trees were fairly small, that is small in their cross-section. But another side So the blocks 1 and block 2 of the experiment were on this shallow soil, and blocks 3 through 6 were on a deeper soil, very deep, and the trees were almost twice as big as the trees in the shallow soil. So this was a typical situation for many growers, that different areas of the orchard have different soil types. Okay, so these are the stem water potentials, again in megapascals here, but notice that the range goes all the way down to about 30 bars, or 3 megapascals. The dashed line were the trees under the deep soil conditions, and the solid line were trees under the deep, shallow, yeah, solid line is shallow, and the dashed line is the deep soil conditions. And even for the 100% irrigated trees, you can see that there's a very small difference, but a consistent difference, that the trees in the shallow soil were a little bit more stressed than the trees in the deep soil. And this was true for every treatment. However, when we withheld water for a long time, all the way from this arrow to this arrow, was the lag phase of fruit growth, then you can see that the trees in the shallow soil experienced very severe stress compared to the trees in the deep soil. In fact, we even had to irrigate a little bit because we were afraid of hurting these trees too much. So this happened in all the treatments at different amounts, but what I'm going to talk about is the difference between D2, the most stressed trees, and the D1 and D0, where there was very little difference between the fully irrigated and the non-irrigated trees. So we had, in the shallow soil, more stress, especially during cutoff, and we had these 2 treatments that I'm going to focus on. So I've color-coded these 2 treatments. So the blue are the least stressed trees, and the red are the most stressed trees. And if you look at yield, let's start with yield. The shallow soil blocks, the yield of the the wet trees, we will call them the wet trees and the dry trees. The yield of the wet trees was higher than the yield of the dry trees. The yield of the dry trees was the lowest of all of these trees, and there were some significant differences. However, if you look in the deep soil plots, the exact opposite was the case. That the wet trees had the lowest yield and the dry trees had the highest yield. Now, if we go back to flowering, then we see that in the deep soil blocks, as well as the shallow soil blocks, there was a much higher level of flowering in the driest trees compared to the wettest trees. It was significant in the shallow soil, was not significant, but the trend was the same. However, in the deep soil blocks, the dry trees, in the shallow soil blocks, the dry trees had a lot more fruit drop, and that led to a lot lower fruit load, which led to a lower yield. Whereas in the deep soil blocks, the dry trees had the highest flowering, a little bit high drop, but it wasn't enough to change the load or to reduce the load, and they still had the highest yield. So here was an example where we got opposite results from the same treatments on different soils, and as this is why we need to monitor the plant, because the plants were already telling us that in the shallow soil that the dry treatment was too much stress, but then we discovered that in the deep soil the dry treatment was maybe a good stress. Another thing that the prune growers were very concerned about at the time was cracking. And it was believed at the time, and there was good evidence at the time, that if you dry the trees out, that when you irrigate them, they will have too many cracks. And that actually happened in the shallow soil, but it did not happen in the deep soil. The shallow soil had a very low dry ratio, which is good, but obviously it had low yield and it had small size. And in the deep soil, it still had a good dry ratio and slightly smaller fruit, So this is the fruit per kilogram and the count per pound. Still the size was acceptable. So there were some reasons to think that maybe withholding water from prune trees might have some good effects on tree productivity and dry away. So this is when we decided that maybe we could have a prescription, like a doctor, for how much stress should be on a prune tree at what time. And so we said that the prune trees should be around -6 bars in the beginning of the season, and by the end of the season that they could be around 15 bars, and that would improve dry away and may not hurt size, and may actually improve flowering and increase yield. So we had a whole table of values of what it should be at different times of the year. So this would be considered a target value. This is what the target is that we're trying to accomplish in the trees. So many years later, we decided that we should have an experiment to demonstrate this. And we went to a monastery where in fact there were monks that they made wine and other things here in California. It was on a very deep soil, and they had been growing prunes for a long time, and they had very large fruit but a high dry ratio, and they were wondering if that could be improved. Now, the reason I mentioned that this was a monastery and there were monks there is that they were accustomed to irrigate every 2 weeks, because this is what the extension had recommended and what they had been following. And I should say they were very religious about irrigating every 2 weeks. But they wanted to ask us what were the trees feeling. So we began to measure the trees, and this shows the dates and what we observed and what the fully irrigated value would be and what our recommended value would be for these dates. So our recommended value was around 8 to 10 through the end of May, let's say, and they actually began to get close to that value. And the baseline, they were near baseline in the beginning, and they started moving away from baseline gradually through the season. So even though we weren't at 10 yet, it had been a long time since the beginning of the season. So they said they needed to irrigate. So we said, okay, go ahead and irrigate. So they irrigated. What happened after they irrigated? Well, when our recommended said 8 to 10, they irrigated, and they actually got values then that were above the baseline, less stress than the baseline, or you could say essentially the baseline values. So these trees went from being very mildly stressed to now not being any stressed at all. And remember that they irrigated every 2 weeks. So they were thinking that by early June, they should irrigate again. Well, there was a little rain on June 2nd, and we measured on June 4th, and they were still at baseline. So we continued to measure all the way through June 24th, and by June 24th, they were still at the baseline. But it had been now over a month since there was no irrigation, maybe a little bit of rain. And so we continued into July. And now by July, we were saying that they should be in a little bit more moderate stress. And they were finally starting to get a little bit more stress than the baseline. Although notice that on this day, we measured 10.4, but the baseline was 9.4. So they weren't very far from the baseline. But of course, July 1st was a long time from the last irrigation. And they were getting very nervous. And they said, we must irrigate now, even though the trees looked okay and the trees measured okay. So they irrigated. Now, when they irrigated, they were worried that the fruit would crack and that the leaves would drop. But after that, they discovered that the trees looked fine. The fruit did not crack. The leaves were still okay. Of course, after they irrigated, the trees recovered to baseline. And now we were saying, oh, well, they should be at 10 to 12. So they waited 1 month here to irrigate and saw that maybe that was okay. So they waited almost another month before they irrigated again. And we were just barely getting into the range, never really got into the range that we recommended. And through August, and they harvested in mid-September, and the trees never really achieved much stress, and they finally irrigated again at the end of September. And of course, the trees recovered back to baseline. Now, what does this mean? This was a demonstration plot, and the grower was happy with the way the trees looked and the fruit-dry ratio, but they only made 4 irrigations in 5 months compared to 10 irrigations that they normally would. So this was a big reduction. And in addition, the trees never really reached our target values, so even less irrigation should be possible for this. Okay, so this just illustrates, and I will show another good illustration of how much less water it may be possible to irrigate prune trees. And for this, I'm going to show an example from Chile, from prune production in this location. Again, standard French prunes, this time on Mariana rootstock. There were, you can see from this map, there were many, many irrigation blocks, 24 different irrigation blocks across this 178 hectare area. And each block was drip irrigated, double line, and there was a range of where the water was coming from. But it was possible to control all of these areas separately. So it took one of our best graduate students, Andres Olivos, coming from Davis, to decide that maybe instead of irrigating uniformly to ET, they should try using the pressure chamber to manage water differently for all of these different blocks, just to see if that would improve the dry ratio or maybe other things about the orchard. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick history of what happened. From 2012 to 2014, the trees were irrigated more or less uniformly based on ET. That they had a problem with fruit drop near harvest. So they were having to harvest the fruit at 9 pounds of firmness in order to avoid fruit drop. They were getting pretty good yields and a good good size, but a fairly high dry ratio. So they changed to a plant-based RDI from 2015 to 2017, and we're still harvesting at 9 pounds, but notice that they weren't getting as much drop as they were getting before. And they were still getting good yields, but the dry ratio and the size were not that different. But in 2018, since they didn't see any drop, they decided that they could, in the RDI, that they could wait to 4 pounds, and this didn't change the yield, didn't change the size, but it had a big effect, a very highly significant effect on the dry ratio. And I don't need to explain to all the prune growers out there that going from over 3 to 2.8 it makes an economically very important difference in drying costs. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on these 2 blocks that are very close to one another, but block 14, you could say, was a wet block because it was in a flat area that was downslope, and block 16 was on a hill, so it was upslope. And even though they were right close to one another, very different soils, very different conditions. Now, this is the latest data from the 1920 year. The dashed line shows what full ETC would be based on the crop coefficient for prune and based on the local reference ET from this weather station. And you see that block 16 in the red was given about the same irrigation as 100%, maybe a little bit more in the beginning, but it ended up the season at about 100%. Block 14 ended up with about 70% of ET. So just by basing the irrigation on the pressure chamber, they were able to save substantial amounts of water in block 14. But actually, this was small compared to all the other blocks. I'm not indicating which numbers the blocks are, but you can see that there are some blocks that received as little as 9% of ET, all the way up to full ET. And all of these blocks were managed individually using the pressure chamber, and they all had similar levels of production, similar dry ratios, and similar tree appearance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you an example and take the 5 highest irrigated blocks and the 5 lowest irrigated blocks, so an average of 84% here and 27% here, and ask a question. So one of these lines, this is the stem water potential that was measured with the pressure bomb. You can see how often they measured with the pressure bomb, almost every day, over the course of the season. So February, midsummer, and I have a line at 30 bars. And so some of these, oh shoot, I didn't want to show that right away. Some of these trees were pretty stressed compared to other trees. You would think that the lowest irrigated trees should be this line and the highest irrigated trees would be that line, but in fact the exact opposite was the case. And what this shows is that if these trees had been uniformly irrigated and all given, let's say that you decided that the real ET for the average orchard was 60% or something. If these had all been given 60%, then the lowest irrigated trees would be even wetter, and the highest irrigated trees would be even drier. So the difference between what the trees were feeling would be much bigger if everything was uniformly irrigated. The reason why these were high irrigated was because it took that much to keep them somewhat in line of their water potential with the other trees. But maybe they should have even had more water. Of course, at some point you can't put too much water on because of soil limitations. But then that's just a limitation of the soil. Okay, so I can propose, I think, a new definition of irrigation efficiency. It's not how uniform the irrigation system is. It's when you are able to irrigate more where it is needed and less where it is not needed. Okay, so it's not surprising that the trees downslope in a flat area might need less water than the trees upslope because of the soil depth and maybe also because water may run down to these trees. But you still have to manage the water from day to day. So I am showing one example here of midsummer, December to January, and block 14, and I'll show block 16 in a moment. So here you see block 14 was being irrigated. The irrigation here is in millimeters on this scale, about 18 or so millimeters every few days. And these were the readings of the pressure chamber for these trees. So in some cases, you can see that the trees were somewhat dry, and then they irrigated and the trees became less stressed. But it's helpful to see the baseline value, because the baseline can change a little bit from time to time. So for instance, on this day, the baseline was showing that a fully irrigated tree would be about 10 bars, and this day it might be about 8 bars. So some of this difference from here to here in the measured stem water potential could be attributed to this difference, but not all of it, because it's a bigger difference. In any case, after irrigation, then the trees look like they're drying out, and then irrigated again and the trees recover. But when you only measure stem water potential periodically, then you're not getting a full picture of exactly what's going on in the trees. So this is where, with Andres's cooperation, we're trying a device that measures stem water potential but is an automated device that can be installed in the tree. Now, this device is very, very small. It's only about 10 millimeters across from here to here. So this device really is the same as a tensiometer. The difference is that the engineers have figured out a way to make a tensiometer on a very, very small scale, okay? I won't go into the details of how this works, but it is installed in a tree. In this case, it's in a vine, and it's measuring the tension in the xylem, in the sapwood of the vine. So these values now are the values measured by the microtensiometer, and that gives you every day of water potential. And they more or less respond like what you saw in the pressure chamber. The values don't agree 100%, and this is something we're still working on, but relatively the values are responding fairly well to irrigations. But what this shows better is how these irrigations were adjusted between block 14 and block 16. You can see that block 16 was being irrigated when the lines are red, and block 14 was being irrigated when these lines are blue. So here they're not too much different, but then at this point the red was being irrigated, but then it was dropping, and when it was irrigated it came up, but it still was dropping away much farther and faster than the block 14 trees. So this is when they decided to irrigate both of the trees more frequently and start giving the trees in block 16 a substantial amount of more water than block 14. This is what led to this period right here between December and January. When you first start seeing these blocks getting much different amounts of water, it was based on this period where it was very clear that they needed to start increasing the water to block 16 and increasing the frequency to both blocks. So this shows the value of daily measurements, either with the pressure chamber or with automated devices, and how it helps you manage water very accurately. So to summarize the talk, RDI was initially suggested that we should save water this way, but it is turning out that the real goal of RDI is not just to save water, it's to manage the plant, to try to get the plant to do what you want it to do. And if dry away is important and you need stress to have better dry away, then that's what you're trying to manage for the plant. Maybe we can call this targeted deficit irrigation, then regulated deficit irrigation. I don't care what you call it. The important thing is, what is the target? And the target, I would suggest, is stem water potential or something else that's closely related to what the plant is doing. Right now, there are many ideas, many suggestions, many salesmen telling you that they have the magic response, but we're still working on that. Now, I think that trees and vines have many examples of beneficial responses to stress, and also excess vigor is a problem. So stress can be used to control excess vigor. So it's a good, I think trees in general are good examples of where we need to use the pressure chamber or other devices to define what the target should be, when the target should be, and why the target should be throughout all the season. And I would include even in the winter time, because we have now evidence that even in the winter time, dormant buds are influenced by water stress. So in prunes specifically, we know that we can increase yield in some cases, but the dry ratio and lower drying costs are beneficial for sure. In almonds, I haven't talked about almonds, but we are, it's generally practiced here in California that regulated deficit or target deficit irrigation, usually controlled by the pressure chamber, improves hull split, reduces hulls rot, and improves harvestability. And in walnuts, we are finding that actually the growers are irrigating too soon in the spring and causing midsummer nutritional disorders that don't occur when you wait to begin irrigation in the spring, also based on the pressure chamber. So I would say that the pressure chamber is proven to be a reliable guide, that we are very excited about current commercial sensors that are under development. But you need to be careful about what the sensors are measuring. Some of the sensors, the sensor, the microtensiometer that I showed, also the Saturas sensor, are actually directly measuring stem water potential, or they're trying to directly measure stem water potential. Then other ones, such as the Phytech dendrometer, which seems to be very well correlated with the pressure chamber, is not directly measuring it, it's indirectly measuring responses to water potential. So all of these devices need a little more research, and hopefully we can get them to agree 100% with the pressure chamber, but only time will tell if that is possible. So thank you for your attention, and I think we have some time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. How did I do?
Good, very good, Ken. Thanks a lot. Yeah, there are a few questions. Let me start with this. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the tree selection? Where do you take the measurement? And for example, in the same example you were showing here in Chile, in Rengo, where you had two soils, the shallow soil and the deep soil, should you use, and let's say that's one irrigation block, okay? Should you measure in the shallow soil, in the deeper soil? Should you use both, do an average? Can you talk about that, please?
Yes, I can talk about that. And I have a very definite answer to your question, should you measure in the shallow soil or the deep soil? And my answer is yes, okay? That is, if you have differences in soils, and you can already see the trees are different in their size in those soils, this was the case in the first prune experiment we did, then your only good choice is to measure both and to try to manage the water differently in both. Now, if you can't manage the water differently in both, you should try to decide the economic benefits of fixing the system so you can manage the water differently in both. This is an economic decision that will depend on how much trouble it is to change the system and how much benefit you get from managing different. I will tell you one quick story about an almond grower. So we had an almond grower that had different irrigation blocks, but and he knew that the soils were different, but the irrigation block didn't exactly match the soils. But when we measured the trees, this grower was trying to reduce irrigation during the hull split period, so that the splitting of the hulls would be the same on all the trees. Now, let me make this clear. During hull split in almonds, when the hulls begin to split, you have to get on a pesticide spray that is very, very important for navel orangeworm, because the flight of navel orangeworm occurs at that time, and they can lay eggs in these nuts that are starting to split, and they cause lots of problems. Well, so this orchard, some of the hulls were splitting a month ahead of when others began to split, and this is a huge headache for managing the pesticide. So it's a big, big economic problem to have differences in hull split. the grower found that the trees on his deep soil, it was actually a gravel soil compared to a loam soil. The trees on the loam soil would split much later, but he could water with less than 50% of irrigation to get those trees to split at the same time as the gravel soil. But there were some trees on the loam soil irrigation system that were actually on the gravel soil. And he just, and it was such a big effect that he dug some trenches and extended the irrigation system so that those trees on the loam soil system would be on the gravel soil system, and that solved the problem. But he would not have known anything about that, and he had tried many times to try to cut back the water. He didn't realize how wet those trees on the loam soil stayed, and how long it took for them to dry out until we used the pressure chamber. I hope that wasn't too long of an answer.
No, perfect answer. Can you comment on the importance of time of the day when you take the measurement? And I know that some people, sometimes they collect the leaves and put them in a cooler and then take them to the shed and measure everything in the shed, for example.
Okay, we have tried this in Prune specifically, and we found that there is no amount of time that the leaf can be in a cooler and stay the same. But to tell you the truth, we have not done a big experiment to find out exactly. It may be possible to store the leaves, but if they get a different value on the tree and after storage, I would make a big warning. And the big warning is, don't assume that just because the value is 3 bars or 4 bars or 5 bars difference, that it's going to be the same difference all the time. It may be a 3 or 4 or 5 bar difference for a wet tree and only a 1 or 2 bar difference for a dry tree, which would mean that when the trees are wet, you think they are, when the trees are dry, you think they're wet. It's very important to detect differences in stress that are reliable and not just relative differences. Because, for instance, a wet tree would have a leaf with open stomata, and if the drying out in the box, in the storage box, is due to water loss from the stomata, then a dry tree will not change so much as a wet tree. And then this causes there to be a bigger error for wet trees and a smaller error for dry trees, and it makes interpretation of the data very, very difficult.
Okay, there's a couple of questions that I guess their doubt is that, is there any difference in the stress level or what you measure with the pressure chamber, depending on things like aspect, whether the orchard is facing east or west or south or north, or whether you're inland or whether you're in the coast, but in terms of the level of stress that you're looking for?
Well,
I don't know if that's clear. My question is clear.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
It's a good question. So far, we have found that no matter if you're in Chile or California or Israel or Australia, that we get about the same kind of values for fully irrigated trees and for stressed trees. The one thing that we don't know, and so I would say if you're on a north slope or south slope or deep soil or shallow soil, 10 bars means the same for a tree on that soil as it means for a tree on another soil. It may mean a very different irrigation decision for the grower on those different soils, but I think it means about the same thing for the tree. The only thing that I'm not sure about is it may be that 10 bars in the springtime may mean a different thing for the tree as 10 bars in the middle of the summer. It may be that trees can acclimate to the stress better, so that in the springtime, even a small stress may cause a big effect. And in the summertime, that same level of stress may almost make no difference. But we really haven't done the experiments to define that yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, yeah, different soils, different aspects, different irrigation management for sure. But the target, I don't think the target should be different.
Okay, perfect. There was another question regarding the day after irrigation. Okay, can you see numbers outside your baseline because your vapor pressure deficit that day is too high?
Okay, when you say outside, it's important to understand whether you're meaning outside more negative or.
Yeah, I guess what I guess the question is, if you irrigate, can you have a stress tree the next day because the day is too dry, because the vapor pressure deficit is too high that day? Meaning, oh, I irrigated, the pressure chamber is saying that the tree is still stressed, but that's because today is a very dry day. It's not because my irrigation was not enough.
Okay, so I want to make sure that I understand the question. So you irrigate, and the next day you go out and it's very hot and dry,
Mm-hmm.
and the baseline, let's say, is 12.
Right.
So then you measure the tree and you measure 12 or 13?
No, you measure 13.
Okay, okay. So it's a little bit below baseline. 1 bar is not so much, yes. Mm-hmm. And I would say within 1 bar, it's probably around the baseline. So it may be that it takes the trees a little while to recover, so that yes, you irrigated and they recovered, but they haven't fully recovered yet. In our trees, in a sandy soil, we see recovery immediately. But you know, on a clay soil, it may take more than just overnight to fully recover. Mm-hmm. So then that would lead to lower than baseline value than the next day after irrigation, and they may then get to the baseline the next day. But here's a very important thing: when you drip irrigate, you do not wet all of the soil. Mm-hmm. So that means there's going to be some roots in dry soil all the time. So it may be that actually matching the baseline is not so easy, maybe even impossible, with drip irrigation. I think you can get close to the baseline, but this is another question about that we don't know yet.
Perfect.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thanks. I'm getting some questions from the grapevine growers. You mentioned 10 minutes for after covering the leaf for stem water potential, right? We in the wine grapes, we tend to leave it longer than that. So is it because of difference between the species, or?
No. There's no problem to leave it as long as you want.
Okay.
But are you putting a bag on a leaf that's in the shade in the lower part of the canopy, or on a leaf that's in the top of the canopy?
That's a good question. So I do it in the shade part of the canopy. Some people do it in the sunny part of the canopy. Yeah. So if you can comment on that, that'd be great.
Well, so the leaf water potential, which has been used a lot, let's say, in grapevines. The objective of leaf water potential is to take a leaf from the upper part, sunlit part of the canopy, and only put the bag immediately before you take the leaf to prevent it from drying out. And so stem water potential is supposed to be for the whole vine, and we feel that that the number that you get from a lower canopy shaded leaf that's closer to the main trunk or the cordon or somewhere is a better indicator of the whole vine than one leaf out on the outside of the canopy. And we've documented that the variation is less for those leaves that are in the shade. So I would worry about taking a stem water potential from leaves that are not already in the shade and close to the main trunk or the the cordons.
Is leaf water potential used in prunes and cherries and walnuts?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because leaf water potential was considered the standard when the pressure chamber first was developed back in 1960. So there's a whole many years of literature where people use leaf water potential, and essentially every crop except for grapevines and maybe cotton decided that the pressure chamber was useless because they got crazy data, they didn't get consistent data, etc. It wasn't until we started using stem water potential that people then restarted using the pressure chamber. So I would say that the only people who use leaf water potential now would be the grape people because they were using it, and maybe some cotton people, I don't know. But most of the other trees all use stem water potential.
Okay, perfect. We're getting a lot of questions now, so I'm gonna pass the mic to Andres so he can ask you a couple more, and I'm gonna check the new questions. Okay.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Hey Ken, thank you for your presentation. Can you hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay, so there has been a lot of questions regarding other crops because it doesn't necessarily that Californian crops match with Chilean crops, right? And we discussed the other day that cherries here, avocado and citrus are very big in Chile. So I would like to ask you about thoughts on these other crops, and if you may want to explain a little bit more what is the baseline, because these the other growers that they grow other crops, they are not familiar with the baseline.
I can't comment on any target values for, that is, you know, the recommended values for cherries and other things. I would say that the baseline, as far as we can tell, almost all of the prunus crops have about the same baseline. We checked that carefully in almonds and prunes, but I've made measurements in cherries and peaches and other things, and they all seem to have about the same range of values. When you asked me to explain more about the baseline, do you want me? I explained a little bit about the baseline in the talk. Can you tell me what I didn't say that is important to say?
Just in simple words, what is the definition of the baseline?
Okay. I'm a professor. I don't know simple words. You know that.
Yeah. You know really simple words.
That's right.
That's why you are a professor.
The baseline is how much suction, how much tension you would expect for that tree on that day at that moment if the soil was fully irrigated. Let's say field capacity soil, no problems with the root system, no problems with irrigation, just nice, wet, good soil in that tree. So because if it's hot and dry, then that tree is going to be pulling harder, and that's just normal, even if the soil is wet. So this is what the baseline tells you, what a fully irrigated tree or vine would have under those conditions of temperature and humidity.
Perfect.
Okay.
I think it's really clear.
But we have to be clear. That's just, let's say, the happiest plant. Okay. We don't know I don't think in horticulture we want happy plants all the time. We definitely want happy plants when they're young and growing and filling the orchard. But you know, like adults, they have to work, so they may not be happy with their job. But we're trying to get them to produce. So being a little bit unhappy or even a lot unhappy may be a good thing for production. So don't confuse, please don't confuse the baseline with the target.
Right. Yeah, we at least in our Prune orchard, we treat our plants as athletes, right? Just go farther in their production. So
yeah.
There's another question that I experienced myself this last season is, what about the measurement when you are dealing with high salts in the trees? Especially in walnuts, we experience a lot of, there's a lot of areas here that they have a high concentration of salts in the soil and in the water. And they show really bad symptoms at the end of the season, accumulated salts in the leaves. So does the stem water potential value represent the right value with when the tree is experience a high concentration of salts?
I don't have much experience with that, and I don't know of any data. But let me ask one question. If you, let's say the baseline is, 8 bars and it's a walnut, and you measure 8 bars, but the tree is suffering from salts. If a tree is suffering from salts, when you measure, do you measure more stress or less stress than you think you should? I don't.
We don't know exactly.
Okay. I mean, because
we just measure and we record what it is. Well, they seem that the trees, they don't seem under stress when you measure with the pressure.
Okay, that's important. And the reason I ask that is because the answer can go either way. Yes, salt could cause more stress, or salt could cause stress in the leaves, not water stress, but calcium chloride or sodium stress in the leaves. And that would close the stomata, and then the tree wouldn't be using so much water, and then it would be less water stressed than a tree that had open stomata and was using water. So if you measure low stress on a salt affected tree, all that's telling you is that as far as water is concerned, that tree is not stressed. Now, does that mean it may be that you have to irrigate more to leach the salts, and it's a salt problem. But what the pressure bomb is telling you is don't irrigate more to solve a water stress problem.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The interaction between salts and the pressure chamber and water and irrigation management, this is a whole new area. Some people are starting to work on this area, but it's a whole new area.
Okay. There's another question regarding how may regulated deficit irrigation or targeted deficit irrigation may interact with the nutrients and the root growth.
That's a good question. In prune or in general?
Well, I guess this is more in general, I would say.
The belief is, first of all, I don't think we have any studies about root growth specifically. I would have to ask Astrid Boulder. Maybe she can give me some idea about that. But mild stress usually has a bigger effect on vegetative growth than on root growth, on above ground growth than on root growth. So mild stress, you would assume, would slow down the growth of the shoots, but not slow down the growth of the roots, or not much slow down the growth of the roots. If you have severe stress, everything slows down. So there's no question about that. I'm sure root growth comes to a stop when there's a severe stress. So that's why we need to talk about the target, that everything is in, where in that target you want to be for each process that you want to manipulate. And right now, the root growth is the least understood of all the processes. Is that okay?
Yeah. So there's another question about the methodology of measuring stem water potential, and regarding early in the season, you know that this is important. Growers that are asking how to measure very early in the season when there's a different way to measure on non-fully developed leaves.
Okay, sorry, you cut out there for a minute, so I didn't get the whole question. But let me. So, are they interested in measuring a dormant twig or just a twig that has so small leaves that you can't put the leaf in the chamber?
Right. Or yes, basically
okay.
Is that it?
If the leaf is actively growing, then that makes it more. We haven't really done a lot of work on this, or any work really. Small leaves are always a problem, even when they're not growing. But then you just have to try to get a pressure chamber that has a small enough seal so that the petiole can fit through it, right? If the leaves are so small that you can't use them, I would put a bag over the whole shoot, terminal shoot, and then cut the shoot off and measure the wood. Measure the same way. But to tell you the truth, this is something that what do you compare it to? There's no other independent way to measure the water potential of that kind of tissue. But and maybe that we have developed a method for measuring dormant shoots. So and they work the same as leaves, but you have to be very patient because the water doesn't come out very quickly. So you have to raise the pressure and wait, and then raise the pressure and wait, and be patient to wait long enough to see if there's water coming or not. I think the same thing can be used for a leafy shoot that has leaves that are too small. You can just put the whole bag over the whole shoot and cut the shoot off and use that in the pressure chamber.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions. Is there any carryover effects on stressing plants in, well, of course, carryover effects in next years?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and actually, I would say that one thing we do not yet understand and maybe don't appreciate is a beneficial carryover of stress on flowering. And I don't know whether it's because of flower differentiation, but what we do know is that typically water stressed trees this year will have denser flowering next year. I suspect actually it probably has to do with internode, that the internodes are smaller so that the buds are spaced closer. So this would be an example of a carryover effect on shoot growth this year that would be good to slow shoot growth down because of better flowering next year. But if the stress is severe, the buds will drop. I mean, in almond, I assume the same thing occurs in prune. If the stress is severe I think in the late summer, the flower primordia in peaches will have more doubles the next year. So yeah, there's all kinds of carryover effects. Okay. But I think it usually takes a pretty severe stress to have serious negative carryover effects. What we don't know is what mild to moderate stress will do that's beneficial stress carryover.
All right. So there's two people that ask about again the salts. The question would be if you see if you have a tree with a high concentration of salts and you see the leaf that is burned, right? Does that burn affect the measurement?
In theory, no. In theory, if a leaf is burned and has necrotic spots on it, it's the rest of the cells in the leaf that are still alive that should contribute to the endpoint. And the pressure is pushing the water. It will not push the water from the cells to the dry part of the leaf because everything is under the same pressure. So in theory, that has no effect. However, you know, I wouldn't put a leaf that was half necrosis, half necrotic in a pressure chamber without testing to make sure that you know I got the same kind of values. But a little spot here and there I don't think makes any difference, as well as you know a little damage from insects or holes from a shot hole fungus or anything like that. They don't make any difference.
Okay. So one last question, and then I will go with Samuel again. Is there any relationship between the water content in the soil and the pressure chamber, the stem water potential?
There's a very broad relationship, certainly. When the soil gets very dry, the tree gets very stressed. But in Prune, we published, one of the first papers we published showed that the relationship between the relationship between the soil moisture and the pressure chamber was very different within a few meters from one tree to the next because the soil was different. So I would say yes, there's probably a relationship, but it's not a very certain relationship, and given the uncertainty of measuring soil moisture, it's hard to know, even if you're on a uniform soil, whether any sensor is going to give a good integrated idea of the soil moisture that the roots are experiencing. So it's just very difficult to prove that relationship or to use that relationship reliably.
Okay. Okay, Samuel, you're on. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Andres. Yes, thanks very much, Ken. There's still many questions. Several are related to other crops. So I know the pomology department has resources about irrigating in not only in prunes but other crops. So maybe they can check that, right? I guess if you Google Kenneth Shackel, you will see a lot of information regarding all that. So. I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
I'm not clear about your question.
It's not a question. I'm just saying that there's a lot of more information about other crops that we basically don't have time to go over all of it, but there's many resources that they can check, whether on your webpage or pomology webpage on drought management.
I would encourage growers, any grower, if they already understand the tree that they're growing and how it grows and what they like to see at different times, they can start measuring the pressure chamber and looking at the trees and already get a pretty good idea of, you know, this is a good thing now, but I want to slow the growth down, and the trees are giving me a near value that's near baseline, so maybe I can wait longer to irrigate or something. They don't need a specific target for a specific time of the year to already improve their irrigation practice by using the pressure chamber or something like it. That would be my encouragement to them.
It's funny how you're an irrigation expert telling people not to irrigate. Wait for the irrigation.
I suspect that there's been a lot more over-irrigation problems than under-irrigation problems, and this is almost for sure true in walnuts.
Yeah. So one last question: do growers have to pay for water in California?
Some do, and it's very expensive, but it's not expensive enough that just the savings in water is a deal breaker, what you call a deal breaker. You know, I mean, if water becomes so expensive that it's a major expense, then agriculture, you know, becomes unprofitable. But yes, there are mostly in the southern part of the state, and there are still examples of growers that pay almost nothing for water because of historical reasons. I don't know if that's the same in Chile. But this is why I've always said that the pressure chamber and managing water is not about saving water. It's about managing your athletes and trying to get them to do what you want them to do.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to switch to Spanish now to say goodbye to the audience. So again, thank you very much, Ken.
El gusto es mío.
Gracias. Bueno, primero que todo agradecer nuevamente a Ken por el tiempo que nos dedicó. Sin duda fue muy provechoso que haya compartido su experiencia con nosotros, y los dejamos a todos invitados, especialmente a los productores de ciruelo europeos, a inscribirse en el módulo de entrenamiento Estrategias de Riego, que aparece aquí en la diapositiva, aparece la dirección, ¿cierto? Que es parte de la plataforma de extensión de UC Davis Chile. El módulo de riego cuenta con la participación de Blake Sanden, que es un Farm Advisor también de la Universidad de California, que es especialista y tiene mucha experiencia en riego y drenaje de diversos frutales. Con eso terminamos y les agradecemos a todos. Muchas gracias.